Hi everyone, Chris here with National Parents Organization. And today I'm here with Alex Bash, who's a LMFT out of the Bay Area in California, and his specialty is dealing with digital addictions, particularly with kids and teenagers and those sorts of things. So, Alex, thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And Alex, I should introduce you and say you've been on CBS News before, as well as the Outside the Screen podcast, Healthy Screen Podcast Habits. You've also given several conference lectures, and you really kind of dug into this topic of digital addiction. How did you get involved with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I first got into the field of mental health some 13, 14 years ago, I was working with a lot of kids and teens that were really struggling. I was doing basically behavior modification in the home, and I kept running into this issue of kids that were clearly very addicted, or at the very least were, seriously misusing technology, gaming, iPads, etc. And no matter what therapist I encountered, no one knew how to treat it. And so people were, experts in autism and anxiety disorders, etc., but no one was an expert in this kind of addiction. And so these kids would just continue to struggle. And, I saw parents, getting divorced and just families kind of falling apart. And it made me decide that, okay, this needs to be my thing. Because as a gamer myself, I already really understood the culture and all that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us have read news articles or seen media videos out there that particularly say how addictive video games and iPads and cell phones and smartphones and those sorts of things are. But can you help
Mhm.
quantify really when we say it's addictive, how addictive is it? Is there some way to quantify that?
Yeah, so quantifying it is a little tricky just because, of course, there's a lot of factors and variables. But in general, if you were to put someone who, meets the criteria for, say, cocaine addiction, put them in a PET scan, a PET scan, um, and look at the concentration of activity in their brain, and then put someone who meets the criteria for internet gaming disorder in that same scan, parts of the brain that have to do with the reward system, the dopamine system, would look identical. And so the addicted brain, and we now know this just from the medical model of addiction, uh, looks like a unique structured brain. You can differentiate a neurotypical brain from an addicted brain. And so, we can now see that in kids and teens, which is pretty terrifying because that then means that, um, right, they could go on and, develop substance use disorders and other addictions as well.
Yeah, it's certainly very scary stuff, especially for parents that are going through divorce and may not be on the same page with this stuff. And really, it's can be difficult to co-parent. I think through this when both parties aren't really kind of on the same page about it, right? Um,
Yeah.
so what are some of the symptoms that you see of somebody who really has an addiction to digital technology versus somebody who's just kind of using it? I mean, what are some of the telltale signs that a parent can use to be like, okay, this is now a problem, right? Because I'm, at some point you've got to realize that kids are going to use these digital devices, and that's just part of our everyday lives, right? But so I think some parents may not want them to use them at all, but that may not be terribly reasonable in today's society, and when people need to use these things. But how can a parent tell if something is truly an issue or not, and when is it time to get help?
Yeah, that's also can be a tricky one. There's a good way to differentiate that, and that's basically kind of just as a rule of thumb, if it's having a significantly negative impact or preventing the like full normal functioning of a particular area of life. So let's say social relationships, family relationships, self-care, sleep, exercise, eating healthy, eating enough, not too much, not too little. Those sorts of really kind of fundamental parts of life. When we start to see those areas, school, of course, grades, um, when those start to get impacted, that's when the antenna need to go up. And that's when parents need to investigate further. If someone is really into soccer and, they dream of soccer, they play soccer all the time, doesn't mean they're addicted to it, because with addiction, it means that there's again, significant impairment in multiple areas of someone's life. Of course, if you take it away, right, usually parents will see huge explosions. It can cause suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, aggressive incidents requiring police response. So those sorts of issues arising are pretty good indicators.
And in your work, have you seen when parents are divorcing, or do they typically tend to disagree on if somebody is addicted or not, or their kind of level of addiction?
Yeah, so that's another interesting one, because typically, obviously it of course depends, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen that happen where one parent is maybe more permissive, which of course, like any system, systems want to stabilize, right, for there to be homeostasis, and thus it kind of forces the other parent to, kind of overcorrect, and so suddenly, the kids may be spending a lot more time at the relaxed parents' house because it means they can binge more. And then, of course, the addiction just really runs rampant. And one of the best things I've seen to kind of prevent those sorts of issues is really to have a unified family media plan. And basically, what that means is that both parents get together and say, hey, for the sake of our kid or our teen or young adult, and for co-parenting, harmony, let's just agree these are the rules. This is when bedtime is. This is how much time they get during the week versus the weekend, etc.
And would you recommend that parents write down this media plan and put it in writing? Is that something that you would put in the divorce papers?
Absolutely. I've worked with plenty of folks who've actually incorporated it into their divorce decree specifically.
What are some good things that make a good media plan for parents to help avoid addiction?
So a big one is, I mean, for one, it's how you talk about it, right? So making sure that parents, when they're broaching the subject, of course, you want to try and be as collaborative as possible with the kid. Obviously, that is only possible to such a degree, depending on how they're responding. But making sure that you're not hating the game, treating gaming as something negative, as something horrible, because often with kids that are either addicted or just very immersed in that world, it's become part of their identity. So hating the player is often what it can feel like versus just hating the game. So that's something I often tell parents is hating the game equals hating the player. Um, and so treating it just as, a hobby, a passion, and trying to thus limit it in that way, right? Like you wouldn't let your kids stay up till 3 in the morning doing anything, right? No matter how positive the activity is. So just trying to kind of have that balanced attitude is important. There's also a lot of really good apps actually for co-parenting. Um, there's one in particular that I really like, and I don't know if I can plug that right
Sure,
now.
go ahead.
Okay. So the one that I tend to recommend, well, there's a couple. One is Q Studio, and there's a lot of different apps like that. Bark is another one that helps parents limit or moderate their their kids' gaming use, and that way both parents can have the app installed on their phones, and so they can easily limit time or add time as needed. Um, but one of the other issues that often can come up is the fact that parents will disagree on some aspect of technology use or something like that. And so I try and really encourage parents when they make the media plan, for example, to use I guess a way to think about it is you have the content of what they're playing, right? So the game, Counter-Strike, let's say, for example, but then you also have the amount of time they're playing it. And just as a good rule of thumb, the content, the quality is much more important than the quantity. So if a kid spends 5 hours a day on their computer, but 3 of those hours are spent learning how to code, right? That's fantastic. So just as a good rule of thumb, that's helpful. But as far as the co-parenting apps, Mobicip, Mobicip is a good one. Um, but really, family time is another one. But there's a lot of those out there. So I always encourage parents just to check that out as far as co-parenting apps are concerned.
Yeah, and I think one of the really difficult things about co-parenting with kids and technology is really just kind of staying on top of limiting the screen time, right? Because or what what they're doing online. I know the apps make it easier, but certainly it can take a lot of energy from a parent to really be on top of it all the time. And do you have any suggestions there for parents?
Definitely, it's easy to get stuck in the kind of arms race, I like to call it, where, okay, the kid found a way around, this limit, so I bought this program and they found a way around that, and, it just escalates and it's just a game of whack-a-mole and it never really ends well. So if parents are getting stuck in, that sort of process, right, it's time to try something different. Sometimes it's necessary to take everything away for a short period of time. It's an acronym actually called TPOTS. And the idea there is to really do, a reset, so to speak, and to reset the time, reset the sleep schedule, because often the excessive gaming is going to magnify the effects of any other co-occurring disorders. So ADHD is a big one. Of course, anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, OCD, autism spectrum disorders. So trying to really just limit the gaming if you need to, taking it away, having a safety plan in place just in case. So knowing the number for, if there's a mobile crisis response team. Most counties in California have something like that. And those are trained therapists that will talk to you on the phone or even come out to the house to mediate, high intensity conflict. And if needed, implement a elevated level of crisis response, which might even include, unfortunately, sometimes going to the hospital. But again, that's free. It's just paid with your tax dollars, and so yeah, that's a good resource I always recommend for safety planning. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to approach it, but ultimately, just looking at how your kid is doing and saying, all right, are they getting all their needs met? Are they happy, healthy, and successful? They're not perfect. They're still going to have attitudes. Maybe they're, not at their age doesn't match their emotional age. That happens, but is it good enough? And at least here in the Bay Area, that's often a challenge sometimes for parents is just accepting the good enough.
You mentioned a reset, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. Typically, how long does somebody need to abstain to be considered a reset? Is it a day? Is it a week? I mean, what's that time frame look like?
That's a good question. There's a few schools of thought, at least that I'm aware of. One is, and this is what you'll see in a residential treatment center. So that's the highest level of care. Um, with individual therapy once a week being the lowest level. And those places like Restart, for example, is a wonderful program in Seattle. And they are, full on abstinence. So they'll say, okay, it's not a short period of time, right? It is a permanent reset. Just as someone, who identifies as an alcoholic, right? They're not going to pause drinking. Um, so that's one end of the spectrum. And then as you move up, usually about 30 days, um, when I've done it, I typically push for 2 weeks. And that way we can compare one 7-day period against the other 7-day period and see, okay, are things trending up? Even if, one of the things trending up is conflict, which is inevitable. It's, really one of the biggest things that parents can do is to be consistent. And if they set a boundary, if they set a restriction, no matter what, sticking to that. Because if kids feel it's, intermittent or it's otherwise permeable, it's going to lose, all kind of credibility. So that's another big factor, certainly.
And when you go through the reset, what are some common things that you see people do better with? I mean, what are the benefits of doing the reset for a lot of your patients?
Yeah, so it's something I typically, thankfully at least, don't need to do in the more severe, complex situations. When I do that, I and I talk to parents about this, right? If someone was addicted to a drug and you just said, "That's it, I'm taking it away," obviously, of course, they'll go into, chemical withdrawals because it's a chemical dependency, but there's still the psychological dependency with gaming. And so if you just take it away, which sometimes parents will do just because they're so exasperated, uh, the person can react again, like I was saying earlier, with suicidal um, attempts, with running away, risky behaviors, and often can fall into really deep depression. And so I really try before I do a reset to make sure they've got really good coping strategies. They've got a great list of, non-tech related activities they can do. And I'll actually try and organize like a menu basically of activities. So here's activities you can do on your own with yourself. Here's activities that require a parent. Here's ones that are outside, inside, art related, um, classes, like hands-on classes for things like wood shop, metalwork, or smithing. Those are some common ones. Dungeons and Dragons is incredible. That's probably one of the top ones that I often see work because there's actually therapeutic versions of those sorts of tabletop role-playing games. And there's actually organizations all over the country where you can take your teen or young adult or kid, and there will be someone who's either a therapist or a trained mental health provider who will, lead a um, a group of similarly aged people on a multiple month or multiple week, D&D journey and build, of course, social skills and communication skills and everything else. So those sorts of things that are more pro-social and are out of the house are also big ones I recommend, up to and including exercise as well.
I'm always amazed at the kind of longevity that Dungeons and Dragons has because I mean I remember doing it as a kid and and
Yeah.
I hear about people doing it now. I'm like that's still a thing, and but I just remember
Yeah.
doing it and have some great memories of it, and I'm glad to see that it still has some legs. But it really, really always amazes me every time I hear about it. Especially with cell phones and things like that. That I mean,
Mm.
you just don't get the same imaginative thinking that you do, doing some of those old role play games, which I think is fantastic. I want to talk a little bit
Yeah,
about
truly.
um, kids and socialization in sort of the, we'll call it the post smartphone age, right? Because
Mm.
again, growing up, when I was growing up, you get kicked out of the house and you found a group of friends to roam around the neighborhood with, and basically came home when it was dark, right? And
Yeah.
nowadays,
Yeah.
kids are so connected, and I think kids really socialize differently than we do today. And one of the things that I learned,
Mm.
as a parent with my kids when they were growing up, is I really had to tell myself, like, hey, they socialize differently, and sometimes that's okay. What's your thoughts on how socialization for kids and like particularly teenagers, how that's changed, and how should parents handle that?
It's tough out there, man. It is rough for these kids and teens and young adults. We've seen just the data really supports this. The number of what people consider close relationships, in these age groups just declining exponentially, and really kind of for the first time. And Philip Zimbardo, who did the Stanford Prison Studies, wrote a book about this a couple of years ago, which was all about how these newer generations of people that identify as male are really, by and large, falling behind their counterparts, particularly when it comes to relationships and social emotional development. So it's a struggle, and so all this technology, right? Of course, ironically, has technically made us more connected, but actually even less so because kids want to spend more time talking to their friends online, right? It's a common one parents will hear that their kids will say, well, I mean, I have plenty of friends. They're just online. They're all over the world. Like, that's incredible. Why would I need to, go hang out with someone in person? And of course, right, often the kids aren't talking over video like we are. They are talking audio only, often using programs like Discord, for example. And uh, as you may know, the majority of our communication is nonverbal. So the kids, teens, young adults are missing out on developing a huge chunk of the, skills and abilities necessary for, uh, socialization. So when they're then put into in-person situations, it's much harder for them to not only develop those friendships, but also develop deep ones. To know how to be vulnerable, to know, how to uh, take the kinds of steps you would need to in order to have those deeper relationships.
Do you think once kids kind of grow up and leave the house and go out in the real world and get a job where they have to interact with other people kind of daily, is there some sort of transition period where they sort of catch up and learn all those skills, or are they kind of forever behind?
I will say it does, of course, depend on the person individually. But unfortunately, what there is actually fairly recently, some large scale studies have shown that there's a large chunk of kids, teens, young adults who maybe will develop some of those skills, but who will, like you said, be kind of forever behind. And one of the biggest factors there is, again, keeping that homeostasis. So, gaming the same amount, um, getting into college, but then staying in their dorm room, for a lot of the time, not joining clubs or other activities. And once the brain stops developing, it stops going through the sort of pruning process that happens during adolescence and into young adulthood, which is basically the brain says, okay, I'm not using, these pathways over here as much, so I can just trim those, prune those, get rid of those. And if those have to do with, pro-social skills, pro-social development, things like that, it's again pretty difficult to catch up. Then again, I've seen plenty who, once they got to college and they got out of the house, just finally actually being on their own, forced to kind of sink or swim, worked wonders more than any therapeutic intervention ever could. So sometimes that is actually really what's needed, because that forces a level of discomfort that they have to work through. And without discomfort, right, it's pretty hard to grow.
Oh, yeah, great points. I want to get a little bit back into co-parenting and tell me a little bit about, what can two parents do when they disagree? And then the other question, follow on to that is, what happens when you have one parent who, really won't work with the other parent? So the first question really is, how can parents co-parent better together when there's disagreement about the technology? I know we mentioned having the plan, but what if the two parents can't agree on the plan?
Yeah, yeah, that of course happens. From my experience, one I think just a good example of that situation is when one parent is in the tech industry, right, and is very, considers themselves a technophile, and thus, of course, right, might be more likely to be more lenient with their kid. And what I find is helpful is to, in that case, abandon the uniform media plan because that's obviously not working, and instead create one that brings that parent in. So, I'll essentially say, okay, you don't want to do what the other parent's doing. That's totally fine, right? It's your house, it's, your kid. So let's get you more involved in, their relationship to tech. So you're, an engineer, let's say. So why don't we sign them up for a coding class and you can help them, or maybe you guys want to take a woodshop class together, or, a computer repair class, or, you can help them build their first tower. Just trying to bring them in, because, of course, you're going through a divorce. It's not uncommon for there to be a lot of conflict. And so you're used to just, having your dukes up and fighting. And so the idea of moving forward, moving towards the kid, sometimes can, not be something that is happening because the parent is so focused on fighting the other one and on being, a little more lenient. So that's again something I found that's helpful. And then we have just two different plans, and each parent has the others, so they kind of know what to expect. But something that tends to work well is to at least have a uniform transition plan. So what is the transition from house to house going to look like? And how do we make that transition as seamless and conflict free as possible?
Awesome. And what do parents do when they don't agree on, like say a specific game? So maybe one parent doesn't want the kid doing a first person shooter game or something like that. What's the best ways to deal with those sorts of conflict?
Yeah, so in those cases, something that I'll sometimes do is I'll have the parent that is against it, basically write out, here are the pros and cons. Pros might be, okay, I see that she really likes it. I see that it is at least a bit social. Um, and doing the same with the other parent, and then looking at where there's overlap. And so sometimes what will happen is, oh, there's actually a lot of overlap with, again, not the content, of course, of the game, because that's what's being disagreed on, but the process of what's happening in the game, right? The teamwork, the collaboration, the community, etc. Maybe there's other games that would also meet, those criteria, would have those sorts of things happening. Um, and then, at that point, it's just about kind of helping the kid transition to that game.
Awesome. Well, we've covered quite a bit of ground here today, Alex. Is there anything else you wanted to cover before we signed off?
No, I mean the only thing I would say is that there's addiction can be a very charged and scary word, and obviously holds a lot of stigma. And something that I often just tell parents is that to meet those criteria, it's got to be pretty severe. And the majority of kids, teens, and young adults who maybe game a lot, it doesn't mean they're addicted. They might just be abusing it. They might be misusing it. And sometimes actually it it's nothing to do with the games. The games are just a placeholder. It's actually about a resentment that one parent has towards the other or something like that. And so I can't tell you how many times I've done my initial assessment of the kid and then ended up taking one of the parents on as an individual client instead.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, you'd be surprised. Um, yeah, so I just always encourage folks just to kind of be open, when going through the process. But, if you have concerns, meet with a mental health provider. There's nothing to lose.
Yeah, excellent advice. And I know you have a website. We'll post a link to that in the notes of the show here. Where else can people find you online?
Yeah, my Psychology Today profile, of course, and then my website, resetfromtech.com. I try and do a blog post that's, of course, pertinent to these sorts of topics, as well as post resources each month. Um, and yeah, folks are welcome to email me or call me. I'm always happy to help.
Awesome. Well, Alex, thanks so much for coming on. Such an important topic about kids and their relationship to technology and making sure that they don't get addicted to them, so it doesn't degrade other parts of their lives. Thanks so much for coming on, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. Appreciate it.